Well, this is going to be something different. This is a new series that I'm going to be doing called the Mentor Series, where I sit down with somebody who has made an impact in the industry or has made an impact on me in broadcast engineering. And today, this video, I am talking to Rob Branch. And Rob I've known for a long time, 16, 17, 18,
19,
20 years.
I would say probably 1998, maybe, something like that.
Well, it was before my time in 98, so probably 2000.
Yeah, 2000.
99, 2000.
Yeah, that's right. Right.
Wow, it's been a while.
Yeah, in Temecula.
Yes. Oh, the good old days of KRTM. But Rob's worked with a lot of people, not just us, a lot of broadcasters as both an engineer and a broker. And, I mean, if he wants to talk about the broker part, that's fine. It's cool. It's exciting. But we're not here to talk about brokers. We're here to talk about engineers. He's a very accomplished engineer. And, like I said, one of the first engineers that I've met, and that has really made an impact on me getting into this industry. So, hi, Rob.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. All the way out from Las Vegas into here in Costa Mesa.
Absolutely.
So, let's start from the beginning. You've been in engineering for how long?
Well, I got into the industry in 1988. I went to Liberty University and was hired out of that into the LBN television network in the master control area for a while, which is how a lot of television engineers start out. And believe it or not, they were running M format machines, which nobody's hardly ever heard of, Panasonic M format, before M2 came along. And so then I was sort of absorbed into the engineering department, and some mentors of mine who became mentors really pulled me aside and said, "You have a gift for this. You need to go into this full time." They took me under their wing and apprenticed RF and audio and video and radio engineering and satellite engineering as well. And so I worked under them for quite a while. I would say probably a year and a half, and then my supervisor abruptly left, and I ended up with the entire department. Ran it for 5 years before anybody heard of the internet. And so it's changed a lot since then. Then quit and went to work for CSN, and that's kind of how we met, because I worked for them, and then we worked together on KRTM and in Temecula at the time. And I worked there 7 years. I guess when I started, this is not a credit to me, it's all the team members of the place. When I started, there were 10 FM translators and 1 full-service radio station. 7 years, we had constructed 340-odd FM translators, and I believe it was 40 full-service stations. Most of those I had built or helped acquire. And so, yeah, it was very large. And then in 2003, I started consulting. And it was amazing, and it has been an amazing ride since then.
And you've helped a lot of people during that time. I mean...
Yeah, it's been,
more than 10, less than 15,000?
Yeah, I've kind of lost count, but I mean, I definitely have had something to do with over 1,000 facilities. I know that in my life. I mean, one client alone was over 300. And so, and then, I help manage engineering and or consult for now groups with large numbers of facilities in terms of how to mass manage that. But yeah, it's just a lot of fun, and I enjoy it greatly. I wouldn't stay if I didn't, but it was amazing. But so yeah, it's been I think maybe 8 odd foreign countries and remote management in all 50 states, but 49 states present. So yeah, lot of work.
So why, what got you into it? I know you said it was at Liberty is where you kind of started, but what was it that kind of went?
Liberty was the professional start. So at 13, I've always been interested in electronics, but at 13, I became a sort of an avid shortwave listener. And so I would listen to shortwave radio in Virginia in my home and string up antennas in the backyard and stuff like that. And then when I was actually, I apologize, 10 years old, I did that. When I was 13, my parents went to Liberia in West Africa, and I lived there for a year with them. And that was very interesting because what I could hear shortwave-wise was very different and very cool. And I've always been fascinated with other cultures as well. So it's sort of a cultural and an electronics thing, left brain, right brain, kind of what I'm doing now. And so did that and became a ham operator at 16. Got back in the States, got serious about being a ham operator, more study, more electronics. My dad would bring in military radios, and so I would get to play around with these old military radios that were built way better than anything you could do commercially. And it was a lot of fun, just a lot of fun. And so really electronic-wise, my training started in high school, junior high and high school, and then went to Liberty. They had communications program, went into that. But then they were, I had professors telling me, you need to apply for this master control job. And I'm like, you don't even know me, and they're like, no, trust me, you need to do this. And it just really did lead to really a major career. It was really exciting, but it doesn't really get out of your blood. The fascination, we're talking to all kinds of engineers, but it really comes down to the fascination that we can transmit in visible space. A radio frequency signal can be caught on the other end, decoded just about like it was when you transmitted it. It's mind-blowing, really. Still is. It still is mind-blowing that around us right now are every manner of RF,
It's almost like magic a little bit.
Well, it is. It is. It's so fascinating to do, and then to learn how it happens, and then to really get into the depth of how you model it, and that starts to get really, really exciting.
So over the 30 some odd years professionally, did you have a favorite part of what you've done? I'm sure you've had many favorite parts, but
I can't. Well, so I made notes for this, and I have them, and I'm referring to them this morning. I can't pick one thing. It's very hard to pick one thing. I love the left brain and the right brain aspect. I like the personalities involved. I like sort of analyzing engineer personalities versus sales personalities, and ownership, those kinds of things. I love just working on transmitters. I tell people this, I like about half time in my office and half time in the field, because the office is fun, make relationships, analyze things, deal with things on the computer, propagation studies, but then also going in the field and just not losing touch with what everybody deals with. And it's really important to me. And so, it's hard because most consulting engineers are not maintenance engineers, and they have a hard time. It's one of the reasons I started my business, is to bridge the gap between the consulting and the maintenance engineer. Consulting engineer makes a relationship with a manufacturer, somebody they like that'll do what they say, but then the main engineer has to deal with it on the back end. And the maintenance engineer is like, I don't know what these guys are doing. They're nuts, and I have to deal with it all. So, but then the consulting engineer has problems to solve on the regulatory side, and problems to solve FCC and FAA and all of these other issues that isn't obvious to the maintenance engineer necessarily. So each plays a part, but they're not the same part. But then to the GM, it's just all one thing. It's just all engineer. It's just the broad, years ago, I asked a question on the SBE. I think it was the Beyondese group broadcast engineering. It was a listserv or something back then. And I asked, what is an engineer? Because so many broadcast engineers have so mmany backgrounds. Some are just self-taught. Some are come up through the ranks from announcing and that sort of thing. Others are straight out of a school like, I guess Michigan was a big deal back then. And, in some of the broadcasting schools, there were so many different things. So I said, what's an engineer? And the first answer I got is from a maintenance engineer. I prefer the term electronic janitor. because they're made to change light bulbs. Who knows? It's half black art anyway.
Electronic janitor, I like that. Put that on my business card now.
Right,
Electronic janitor. I mean, you've had all these favorite parts. Was there any parts that you kind of not dreaded, but you're just like, I don't want to do this aspect?
Not really. I think the less pleasant parts are when you deal with people who are technology averse, but that doesn't come just from inside the person's head. It also usually comes from their surroundings and their background. The idea that, I'm sure lots of engineers watching this will relate to this. I'm that guy that everybody dreads. I walk in and somebody, an owner or GM or whatever, say, hey, I want to grow this area. And, in the religious broadcasting world, it's a lot about messaging. It's not as much about money. Most of the time, it's a lot about, how effective are we? Can we be effective? Can we expand? And I help people do that, both in acquisitions and that sort of thing. But what I find is that the support staff who's holding up the existing infrastructure is up to their eyeballs in work. And then they'll say, they'll say, I'll be excited. And I'll say, we could do 2 more radio stations in this direction. And I get, you've got to be kidding me right now. How am I going to fit anything else in with what I'm doing? And it's always going to be a situation where if somebody's got vision, whether they're about radio or they're a university, let's say, that's, doing radio. Either way, somebody gets a vision for doing it that isn't the engineer. And then it falls to the engineer to implement whatever that is. That's a major challenge. Timing, cost, manpower. Also, I have a problem with insecurity, meaning with others being insecure. I am not of the camp of you need to make all your information secret so that proves your worth somehow because nobody knows where the information is. That's toxic. I mean, it's okay in a onesie, twosie kinds of a situation, but when it's broadened out to a larger group, very toxic. It's dangerous. But I understand the mentality completely because, when people don't know what you do or people are not necessarily qualified to manage you, how many times have you been in a GM's office and looked at the GM and says, well, what you need is, and you say the specific technical things they need, and they hear blah, 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 and their eyes go, okay, when and how much is it going to cost?
Usually just how much is it going to cost?
Right, exactly. But, and that's an important aspect of it, but it's tough. So I think those kinds of challenges, I love challenges like that, but at the same time, somebody who is just doesn't want to change, doesn't want to progress, that's tough. But it can get diluted if you do too much mass work. Then the quality can suffer. But that's not something that's necessarily in the minds of all the management necessarily to the degree that it could be.
So in all this time that you've been working with customers, different clients, different broadcast groups, little individual groups too, or individual stations too, was there anything that you went, oh no, this is going to fail really, really bad, and then you were able to come in and kind of save the day, like a save type of thing? I mean,
my favorite story.
Okay,
I have a favorite story.
Please.
So there's a station outside of Casa Grande, Arizona, and I can't take credit. It was a team effort, but I just happened to be kind of the catcher of it. So the station had originally been applied for. It was in the non-commercial educational window in 2007, and the station had been applied for and granted on a tower that didn't exist. One of the large tower companies messed up in their database, and it was specified that a tower was in a location that certainly worked on paper. Turns out it was I think they got it off by It was either a minute or a degree of latitude, longitude.
Just a small amount.
Just, many miles away. And the tower was supposed to, basically the tower was plotted 500 feet from the end of a private airport runway. And the station was licensed to a Native American city, and that particular tribe had objected to the station, the licensee using that community of license. The FCC granted it anyway. But there was a covenant that they would try to change the community of license. As well, the station would have served about 3,000 people, and it would have been 25,000 watts. So,
wow,
the cost effectiveness was just not there. So, as a last-ditch effort, I was brought in somewhere between 6 and 9 months before the expiration date, and is like, well, we're not going to do this. But just in case, why don't you fly in and see what we can do? So we went on a search for a transmitter location, and there weren't a lot of good options, but there was a very high mountain between Phoenix and Tucson, helicopter-only access, but did have power, so it wasn't a solar or generator, and a major tower company owned the tower. So we looked at it. I studied it every way I could study it, and I couldn't make the either second or third adjacent channel situation work from it. And I was disheartened. And then we used, thanks to Peter Moncure for this, who's moved on from Radiosoft now, but he spun up 1 second data for me. So I was using 30-second data, and 3-second data still couldn't make it work. At 1 second data, there was so much resolution that there were obstructions that made the third adjacent channel situation work. And so that was one obstacle. Okay, so then we were able to make it work. Then we had to get a community of license change proposed to Mexico and construct a panel antenna directional antenna system before the expiration date was up. And by the time we got started, it was about 7 months, I think. I think that's about right.
7 months left in
7 months left.
Okay.
And, so, and again, Harry Martin was a part of this, helping out. And it was very, he said the FCC held their nose and granted it. That's actually what he said. And, but he helped get that through. So we got everything we needed, international, all of that, in time, got it constructed in time. It is on the air today. With City of License, all of that corrected the way it was supposed to be. Still a challenge to maintain, obviously, any helicopter-only access site is. But it was amazing ride. And we went from probably, it's still not a million, doesn't serve a million people, but I bet it serves, it's got about 150,000 now within the fringe coverages, as opposed to say 3 to 5,000. So I consider that a pretty major accomplishment. And I'd say the second one probably is what happened with K-Wave on Santiago Peak and that madness at the time. But those were both noteworthy because I knew how hard it was. And I knew sometimes when miracles happen, only engineers can appreciate some things that happen because you know how hard it is to do some things. And then when that door is open and you're like, wow, this just doesn't happen normally.
Right.
So that's my...
Now, I've never told the story about what happened on Santiago Peak because I only know a small part of it. So maybe in the future...
we could discuss that. I know most of the parts. Yeah.
I know there were a few parts.
I believe that would be interesting to your audience. KCHG was also an amazing miracle. That was really interesting.
Where's that?
It's Cedar City, Utah.
Okay.
I did the original FCC application. The owner was a pastor or church was advised not to build it. Don't do it. It's not going to be a good idea. And it's a generator only. Pine Springs Knoll, Utah. Sits above, like near Bryan Head, Utah. and 300-foot tower on a 10,000-foot mount, and with generator only, and it was high power. Another broadcaster had something up there, and so we had to cooperate many different ways. Landowner quit claim deed for a tower because it was a old television site. And just that story is just still to me today amazing how it came together to really do well, and the group's doing quite well right now, and still a client. So
I've heard just a little bit about that site. Yeah, that was crazy.
You have to go. It's gorgeous.
That one's on my bucket list.
So beautiful.
Casa Grande is on my bucket list. The helicopter ride.
That's
absolutely.
So cool.
Absolutely. So there's some of your bigger saves, if you will. But were there any that, well, I guess I kind of did fall back into it, but any that looked like this is not going to happen, and like end of the 11th hour?
Well, I worked for a major, very, very large non-commercial group from 2003 to 2000, I guess you'd say 6 or 7. And I was pretty much their go-to fast build guy. So I would get these, we have 6 months. We've made a deal with a landowner. You've got to build a 500-foot tower and put a 50,000-watt station on it. Money's no object, go. And yeah, that was in all major market and all LMA. So we build stations like that near Las Vegas, near Bakersfield. You asked, and I'm getting ahead, but you're asked in the notes, one of them happened in Midland, Texas that way, but that was my nightmare. I could share my nightmare story, which turned out great, but it was rough. And actually I guess that's the one you're talking about. This is kind of that question. So I managed a project in Midland, Texas for this group, and a community of license was Stanton, Texas. And we had about 8 months to build the tower from scratch, nothing. And it was a time when ERI was just cranking out towers and antennas like crazy for radio and for the non-commercial groups. And so, we got the land. Obviously, the land piece was dealt with. And so this was really a development project. Had to put a shelter in, all of that. And with supply chain today, I could have never gotten this done in this kind of time anymore. But we got it done in 8 months. But here's the fun story. So we had hired, and all names will be not mentioned in this. We hired a tower crew. We hired a tower company who was very reputable. But that tower company got in over their head with respect to just the work. I mean, just got busy. It's certainly a high volume situation. And they hired contract crews. And the contract crew that we were using had 2 jobs in the area. So the foreman would go back and forth to each job and leave the tower hands to stack the tower and do it without him. And that was concern number 1 anyway. That was just a red flag. And we had a deadline. We knew we had a CP deadline. So at that point, I was thinking, do I stop everybody from doing this? Do we correct this? Because any time we lose, any daylight we lose is going to be a problem. So we let everybody continue. And they got the tower stacked up, and it was I think it's a little over 500 feet, and it had lambda section at the top. And I think it was a 10 or 12 bay ERI antenna, 50 kilowatt, directional. So, I mean, just the definition of more difficult. So I was flying back and forth from Virginia, at milestones in the project. So I fly back, and it's about 3 weeks. I think it's about 3 weeks before expiration date. Antenna's not hung. Lambda section is up. And I walk onto the site, and the lambda section is visibly bowed at the top. I mean, it's not educated engineer eye bowed. It's layperson, that doesn't look right, bowed. And I, read the crew, the riot act said, this needs to be corrected before the antenna goes up. And they completely ignored my advice. And they put the antenna up and then straightened the lambda section, and it bent a brand new antenna. About 2 weeks before the expiration date. And I was about out of my mind. And, but I must hand it to I will mention this name. I must hand it to the crews at ERI, or not the crews, but the manufacturers at ERI. They were amazing, and they got us all the parts to take to do it. And effectively, we got it on a little under a week before expiration. It was on the air, surveyor, cert, that kind of thing. But that was one that probably, I'm saying this because it's probably my most embarrassing project. Because, if you're a project manager, it's your fault, whether it's your fault or not. You happen to be the guy who's in charge. So there was that piece. But what's really interesting is recently I did some diligence on a site in Midland, Texas, or near Midland, Texas. And I had occasion to go to that site and to see it after, arguably, I think it was built in probably 2006. Something like that. And it's a beautiful site. It's a great site. And it's fine. And everything looks great in the building, and it looks almost like I put it in, except for a little dust that is blown through to kind of accumulate around the building and tower. It looks just like it happened. So, the things that you're the most concerned about and paranoid about was certainly this project was one of those for me. Turns out, wasn't nearly as bad as you thought, but it was one of those things that at the time was incredibly uncomfortable. I would say those are noteworthy in my career in terms of...
Yeah.
And you have an asset that's arguably worth, back then, before the crash of 2007 in radio prices, back then it was a station worth arguably $500,000 at least, maybe $700,000-$800,000, and you've got an asset like a 500-foot tower. You can't, there's no say die. There's no saying die.
Failure is not an option.
Failure is not an option.
So in all of your visits to different sites, different mountaintops, valleys, plains, whatever, did you have any that were like the absolute, what was I thinking? Like that was I was terrified to go to this site, or like the one time, we went to Potosi and we almost slid off the mountain.
Yeah, I would say that I'll take this question a little differently to say the times I was the most nervous in my life on a build. K-Waves, antenna hanging. What happened was the day before the K-Wave antenna was to be hung by a helicopter, by a Bell helicopter on Santiago Peak. For those that are unfamiliar, Santiago Peak is pretty much exactly 1 mile above mean sea level. And in most places, that doesn't mean a lot because the base elevation might be 2,000 feet. So you're 3,000 feet above, whatever. But you can see the ocean. You can see sea level from Santiago Peak. So it's really a mile high for real. And so the day before, we did a pre-construction visit to the site, and with a helicopter operator, and the Santa Ana winds were blowing 50 miles an hour on the site. You could hardly stand up. And it was the day before the build, and the day of the build, 5 mile an hour winds. Everything's fine. But yeah, I mean, you don't know if it's going to happen the way it's going to happen. And that build was very high profile. As you know, it was very legal, Forest Service involved, all of that. So really intense. And, those are the kinds of high pressure situations. It's not just, will the helicopter be okay and make it? It's all the surrounding research, the 2 years that went into the planning of it to see that happen. High pressure situations are, I would say I'm used to them. I'm sure that I'm fairly transparent and look crazy nervous when that happens, but I'm used to it. I have another story, actually.
Yeah, go for it.
So this was during my maintenance engineering years before, what happened was when I was working at Liberty, I also made half again my salary doing contract engineering in the Lynchburg, Roanoke, Virginia area. And most of the people, if anybody's watching from that area, pretty much know all the sites and where all the bodies are buried, And so there was a wind shear storm that came through and just completely leveled trees. And the radio station was off the air, needed power restored to it, needs some work. So we were cutting our way up to the top of the mountain on a rural mountain road and muddy rural mountain road, Virginia. And this is how the electronic janitor thing comes into play. You're not just fixing something, you were cutting, 2-foot thick logs off of roads to cut your way up to the site. This is the kind of thing broadcast engineers go through. We're never really paid enough for that kind of stuff. Well, I was tired. I'd been up 24 hours and probably dealing with other radio stations. And I was holding a chainsaw above my head, cutting. And I was so tired, and I went down just like this with a chainsaw. And the buddy that was with me looked at me and went, and there was a 6-inch chainsaw size rip in my jeans, but the skin wasn't touched. And I'm like, I gotta sit down right now. So it wasn't particularly an RF story, but it's that kind of thing where you have the hazards are real, and the hazards are real at these mountain sites where it's more dry and rocky with maybe some hazards like that out west, but in the east it's you're on a mountain road and you hit the brakes and all you have is road slick as snot in front of you and a drop that's 400 feet. What are you going to do? And those are real stories.
Yeah. See, as you're telling it, I'm like picturing it in my head, and I'm just like,
well, here you can edit this out. I want to tell you another. you can pick which one. So I was really, really young in engineering. Probably my second ever paid gig in freelance in maintenance engineering. And I was working on a Gates BC5B, and it certainly will date people who are watching this who've ever worked on one of those transmitters. It was really made in, I think it was late 50s, early 60s, late 50s. And so, the owners did back then just keep this thing alive forever. Well, it had an audio problem. What turned out to be tubes, audio driver tubes in the transmitter, but that wasn't what I thought at first. I thought I had a mouse had chewed through the audio wire feeding the transmitter. So I'm on top of the transmitter, but the transmitter is on throwing a dead carrier at 5 kilowatts. And so I'm on the top of the transmitter, kind of stupidly, honestly, tracing down a wire to make sure the wire was actually in the transmitter, was completely connected. And, ladder up on the top of the transmitter, and the AM feed lug was still alive. And I put the fleshy part of my arm on the feed lug, and it just kind of burned a little trench about 1 inch long in my arm. That's a very difficult thing to work, to continue working after something like that happens. You're just not, I guess it's a faux pas, but you're fried. You don't know, how you're going to continue, and you just, but you're off the air and you have to do it. But it's one of those things about safety. We talk about safety and taking a buddy and that sort of thing, but, that could have had a very different outcome.
Yeah. Were there any times that were just absolutely, you and whoever you were with just busted out laughing just because, like, okay, really, that happened? And
yeah, I have a story that's my favorite story to tell. Anybody that's been with me at a trade show has probably heard it. So I was working for CSN, building Joplin, Missouri. It's like the second or third translator they ever put on the air. And I was brand new there, so they're like, just go out in the field and, find a crew and do it. So we had to scare up a crew really fast to put it up. We did, and a good crew. We get in a farm field and it has some very large cows. And I really do mean they're the largest cows I've ever seen. They were backs were 6 feet tall. They were big, big, big cows. And so, just in the field, and, a lot of tower sites are in farm fields. So we were in the farm field, and tower crew starts working. One guy goes up the tower to rig and to hoist transmission line, working on stuff. And we're working down below on the racks, and we hear from up above, hey, hey, hey. And of course, when any safety thing, your head straight up, like, what's going on? And we heard, get that cow away from the guy wire. And one of the biggest cows you ever saw was scratching his back on the tower guy wire. And the tower was doing this number. It was oscillating with the guy on it. So it was scary, but it's a great story because it's just like, you just can't make that up. I mean, you're just a guy, cow doesn't know what he's doing. He's just scratching his back on the guy wire. So, yeah.
And I'm sure he's traveling quite a bit of
he is.
distance up there.
No question. The tower is probably, my guess is probably under 3 feet wide. So it's probably 2.5 feet wide. It wasn't a big tower. Maybe around 55 or something like that, maybe.
Those move a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
Wow. So kind of springing back towards the beginning, did you have a mentor that you early on to kind of took you under their wing to say, okay, let me show you the ropes? And
yeah. I mean, I'll go through a little bit of my life in terms of who I know and respect and that sort of thing. Some of them are passed away now. I mean, a good number of my mentors are gone. And early on, Milton Ridgway, who was a television engineer at Liberty University, they don't make people like that anymore. He was just amazing, organized, amazing, up to his eyeballs. They threw all kinds of things. He was primarily television, but he was an excellent RF engineer too. Good supervisor and an excellent boss. And I learned a lot from him, particularly on the management side, because we really hit it off and had a great friendship. But at the same time, the way he managed people and the way he let them do their job and gave them enough rope, but yet still had the element of accountability, but not so intense. And it was old school before, Reich and before all the tools that people try to rein us in to manage. Sorry, that dates me, but, it does. And certainly they're useful. Certainly they're helpful and useful in reporting. But that was before all of that. And, the volume of work that his team got done and all of that. I think there's still a guy today I look up to, haven't spoken to him in quite a while, who's still with us, Al Stevens, who worked there. What I would do is I would go up in Master Control and have all these electronic books in front of me. And I would be studying super advanced stuff. The reference data for radio engineers. What a book, And I mean, it went from that thick in like the 60s to that thick. It was crazy. And I would have that, and the time during NTSC, and I'd talk about okay, wait a minute. So, can you explain to me the blanking interval? Can you? Why is it this way? And what's SCH timing? What is that? And Al would get out his whiteboard, and he would say, okay, so here's RS 178. Here's the envelope. Here's what you don't want to cross. Here's black. Here's absolute zero. Here's here's sync pulse, and just really give me an education in that was more practical, as well as like what can happen. What can happen if a signal is bandwidth limited? What's multiburst for? I mean, these are all old terms that nobody even uses anymore because it's all digital, ADB-SB and all that modulation now, TDMA but back then, when I was learning, it was really a great foundation. But like his office was a 1-minute walk from Master Control. Between shows, I would be like, okay, so I got another question for you about this engineering topic. Mentors are super important because, there's this whole thing about, theoretical is super important, but also, kind of like, when Spock would go back to Vulcan and learn more, that kind of stuff. But then you also have the practical, what really happens in the field. And, I'll study this, but how often does a distortion of this signal really occur? What really is going on? And having those ropes advances you sometimes years if you'll take the advice, of someone who really gets into the deep theory with you but then understands the practical ramifications to that theory, And in FM, it's super important because FM, the more pure an FM or a VHF digital signal is, the less prone it is to exacerbated multipath distortion or perceived noise. And it's one of the things that, everybody would debate this, but we now know to be true in the digital world. The MER, the signal is super important, but back then it was like, well, really doesn't matter what kind of antenna I use and what bandwidth it is. Why is this manufacturer any better than that manufacturer? And there's all these debates that frankly people are just throwing out opinions, kind of like they do today on the news, without a lot of the basis, in fact, in terms of the true science behind it. And I think that those situations and the formative learning there was really important to me because it really is a good part of consulting. Why do you need an antenna to be optimized? Why do you need the manufacturer to come out and make sure that that antenna is bandwidth optimized and that antenna is matched correctly to the transmitter? Most people don't understand that can potentially buy them listeners. And they don't get that. They usually say, well, I'm throwing away $7,000 by that trip. But it's really not true. But then that goes to the owner mindset. It goes to the mindset of, am I really doing this and I want to go all out, or I'm really proud of the 70% I give it? I'd like to mention a few other names about mentors, and maybe you can, okay. A few other mentors for me, I just made a short list here. Sam Stevens, who I believe is either at Howard University or retired now, who works at Liberty University. He had a huge impact on my life. He's an excellent engineer. Worked for ATSC Center for a long time, and just I have a ton of respect for him. And then a few today, Tom Ray in New York City, AM engineer. Most people know him. He wrote books on AM engineering. Most people know who he is. I just think he's wonderful and amazing, and Ben Dawson as well at Hatfield and Dawson. The people I still learn from when we go share stories on projects. Some people like, hey, will you tell your story, Rob? And they're like, wow, this is cool. And I'm like, when Ben is in the room and he shares his stories, wow, this is cool. I still do it. I did it within the past year in LA with him. And Richard White in Phoenix is a main engineer, I think is wonderful. Joe Sands in Las Vegas, I think is certainly has earned his stripes there. Phil Jennings at Hope Media. I don't know that I call Phil a mentor, but Phil considers me a mentor, but I'll say he is definitely a colleague and he is one of the best. He's the director of engineering at Hope Media now. And then Tom Silliman at ERI, I think, what he's done for the industry overall to keep that company as good as it's been for so long is just noteworthy. I mean, they are arguably still the top manufacturer in the U.S. And my apologies to all the other great antenna groups that I work with. So yeah, just lots of industry people that are. I mean, I don't know them well, but certainly Frank Foti and Bob Orban's contribution to the industry can't be underestimated in any way. So those are a lot of my high respect people in the industry, which I think probably many of the people watching this would echo that as well.
So with everything that we've kind of talked about and where you've been in your time, I'm not making it sound like you're retiring, but I'm just
can't do that yet.
Yeah, not yet. But you definitely have had a good amount of time in the industry, and you've watched it for the last 30-something years. Where do you see the industry going as far as engineering, as far as like RF? I mean, I know it is not a unknown fact that there are less engineers today than there were 5 years ago, 10 years ago. But where do you see the industry as a whole and kind of engineering going?
Engineering's piece. It's a great question, and I'll apologize in advance for being so pessimistic. What I'm going to say, and And also keep in mind too that this is the answer I'm going to give here is as an engineer and a broker. And I want to be really clear about that because it changed the way I approach engineering. Being a broadcast broker, I did lots of transactions with CSN, that sort of thing. So I really wanted to get my toe in that water, and it's been quite successful. But I will tell you that well, first of all, the answer to your question is it's a separate session altogether because it just could take up an hour or two of discussion about where the industry's going. Let me start by saying I'm a huge believer in big data, and I wasn't always, but I'm a huge believer in big data, and I think that most broadcast professionals don't use big data to analyze. And I mean, in the engineering world, a little bit more where you're dealing with sites and dealing with equipment histories. But in the business side, big data is not used nearly as much as it should be, particularly in the non-commercial sector, to analyze where things are going. That's number one. And it's available. The data is available. But in religious broadcasters, some religious broadcasters have a problem with it of sort of modeling, depending on a higher power, as opposed to actually modeling what is very likely to happen in the next 5 to 10 years. I think that's a very important point to make in the industry at large. I think and this affects engineering as well. There are less engineers, but there's also less profit in the industry, substantially. I went to one of the last third or fourth to the last NAB radio show, and there was a forum on the radio show of how radio stations get money to buy and to expand. And what basically the forum was someone, 2-3 radio professionals that had brought venture capitalists in to talk about how they would never lend radio stations money because they would only get single-digit returns. So what we're facing in the industry is, I wouldn't call it bleak. I would call it we're at a really pivotal point where we have to push into different technologies and use them, but use them in ways that haven't been done before, where we're not only audio, we're much more holistic than that. I think that's critical for our industry right now. And I think also there are a number of investors that in radio mom and pops that expected to retire on their income from the sale of a radio station. And I'm the one faced with explaining to them that it's worth half to 1/3 of what they thought it was worth because they're thinking pre-2006 numbers when the real crash happened, and hasn't rebounded to any real degree since then. So that I want to preface that and then go into the engineering. And the engineering idea is yes, and I'm going to be super blunt. Engineers are retiring and dying. That's what's happening right now. And so your contract engineers, your engineers who are at maybe a market engineer who a lot of people can relate to this, I'm sure, worked for one of the big groups. I started to say it. Worked for one of the big groups, got laid off, and now the engineer left is now responsible for 5 different markets spread out over somewhere between 100 and 150 miles. That's unsustainable. It's just totally unsustainable. There will be problems that happen, both in terms of personnel, safety, and in terms of just reliability of the radio station, and not to mention legality. So if you look at all of those aspects, we're trying to do a whole lot with a little. And when I first started in this industry, we were already trying to do a lot with a little. Now it's getting kind of ridiculous. And so that's not everybody. There are certainly some noteworthy groups who really understand engineering. I have to say shout out to EMF for this. They understand engineering. They understand the role that it needs to play in broadcasting and how to apply that to their facilities. Totally. I can't say enough for their management. They're both their upper management and also their engineering management in terms of how they execute. It's excellent. And there are other groups too that I could mention, other commercial groups I could mention that really do it the right way and are probably a joy to work for. But then there are other groups that, they just either don't have the money to put into it. They don't even have the margin. If they paid the engineers what they were worth or hired enough of them, they'd be upside down just in that department alone. So, it's a function of the economy, and it's also a function of the engineering talent that's available. I do headhunting for engineers, for groups, and it's tough. It's, you have to have a network. This is a fairly small network anyway in any industry. And it's a very, very small industry overall. In terms of the future of broadcasting overall and where we'll go, I can give you my interpretation of data, which is, I just pulled BIA data for a client, for a brokerage client in a major market in the U.S. And radio is not supposed to rebound. Really, the projections are that pre-COVID, you're one number. Post-COVID, let's just say last year, you are a number that's about 70% below that number in terms of overall market revenue. And in 2026, that's not supposed to be any more than 80% of pre-COVID. So, and many of these groups didn't have those margins to begin with. So you have to ask yourself, how long can the industry afford to take hits like this? And I want to say that I think that there is some potential saving graces, but it's going to require very radical action. And those saving graces are that, in the music formats like, you've got hits formats, you've got rock formats, country formats, which are the staples of radio revenue still. Yet, Spotify, if you look up the EDM genre in Spotify, they have hit numbers in the billions, but yet EDM is not represented as a radio format in the United States to any real degree. So the issue is, how do you engage with a younger audience, and how do you bring new investing blood into commercial radio when it's almost all the same people buying all the same radio stations, just trading back and forth, and to some degree or the other. And that's a challenge that's facing these groups as they think audio. They think like audio. Everybody thinks like audio. They think, well, if I'm not going to do radio, then I'll do a podcast, or I'll stream the radio. And that's not wrong. I wouldn't say that's wrong, but I think it's going to fast become not enough. And then the question will be, what happens when current ownership dies out? And then what do their kids or who their successors inherit? And then, it's not a great time to be a radio manufacturer right now. People are buying, but supply chain's rough. So, hate to be doom and gloom, but these are all things that we deal with on a regular basis in this time. And it's something that really the whole industry has to reckon with. I'll end with this. I think that there'll be a very large hole created in the industry over lack of engineering professionals, both in the consulting and the maintenance hands-on engineering world. And I also think that there will be there really is a big challenge with legal right now in this industry with respect to the shortage of attorneys, new blood that come into the industry that have the correct interpreted answers off of the top of mind and don't have to look at some book to figure out what you asked. It really is tough. One of my dear friends is retiring. I'd make a lot of referrals. Large law firm is retiring this year. When Harry Martin retired, that was a big deal. And Jim Riley, and you just keep whittling off the names, who are doing that. And it is creating a hole in the industry where the industry's not waning fast enough not to need the help of these people. And so it's a really interesting challenge, I think, in the industry overall.
With that doom and gloom. But there still is a need for people to come in and fill these
Well, there's a heavy
complaints. Heavy need.
There's a very heavy need.
And what would you say, because I know a lot of the viewers of this channel are people who are either kind of interested in engineering or are very interested in engineering, but are still brand new. What advice would you give them? Like, what would be, okay, if you could do something right now to help you get in, it's this.
My advice is heavy, hardcore IT background. Number one, just do it. But don't be so fixed on that industry and their narrative that you don't understand other aspects of electronics. It's very hard to explain to a brand new IT person today that there are entire electronic industries that do not involve IT. It's almost impossible because, there's a perception that if I'm connected to it, that I know it. And that's not true. If you're connected to it, you're connected to it, and you have data with almost no idea of how to interpret the data on that third-party device. I would say that goes into manufacturing right now. In any manufacturing, you have to understand what the data controls. You understand what the computer controls. I would say that's absolutely true in RF because you don't not only have the practical piece and the safety piece with RF, you have the regulatory piece with RF. Do you understand how to make your remote control track all the way through the travel of 0 to 100% or 105%? These are all things that are super important, but with the intensity of maintenance that the IT industry needs and security protection, many times in the narrative of the industry, which isn't untrue, but it's got to be both and. The narrative of the industry is we have to, these things to protect are more important than these things to protect, when in fact the vulnerabilities are practically equal. So I do think that it's important that if somebody wants to go into this industry, that they really deep dive into what broadcasting is. The NAB's engineering manual, critical piece of information. Certainly it's become much more IT, important, but at the same time, what's in it is super important because it can't be really just read and understood as you read, equipment manual. You have to understand it and learn enough to recognize what the practical is. That's so important. So I'd say that. I would encourage people to get into broadcasting, but I would always encourage you to have, you make it your day job for the next 5 to 10 years, knowing that at some point a knee will happen in the industry. My current belief is that knee is when Millennial and Gen Z are firmly in charge of management and ownership. At that point, there'll be a knee in the industry where it will radically change. I don't know when that is, but I believe the data exists to predict it. I just haven't gone on that exercise yet. Right, big data. But I also say that I would encourage people, I will tell you, if you go into this industry, broadcasting, and you're good, you'll have 5 years of amazing work. You will be, if you're good and it's known, you won't lack for work. And that may last out to 10 years in my view, where you just won't lack for work. But then at some point you're going to have a skill that's not needed anymore. And so those are important things to keep in mind. The biggest shortage now, in my view, are RF professionals who really understand it well. That's who's retiring and dying. Audio and certainly the wonderful work that both Axia and Wheatstone have done in the audio world, audio over IP world. It's just turned into user-friendly for IT professionals in a good way, really a great way. And so that's wonderful. But in the RF side, it is really changing. And there's need for support consulting in that field in a pretty big way.
If you want to get into broadcasting, learn IT.
That's true. I love this industry. I really do. And I really hope for good outcomes, and it's one of those things that my excitement of working on a transmitter And in one day, I can go literally from installing a transmitter to trying to explain to an AM radio owner how their station's worth, a 50% write down this year from last year. So that shapes my view of broadcasting in a big way. Again, love it. I wouldn't really. I can do other things, but really love to do this and stay in it. But I would also say that there are things that are important to recognize. And I guess if I'd say one last thing to the broadcast industry is, be honest with your press about yourself. I think that's a very important thing to absorb in the industry. I see we're very excited because, we have some numbers that say that 20-somethings are listening to us to some degree, but those numbers would have never been touted. They would have been touted as a failure 20 years ago. And so, that to me are signs that we don't want to just, ride a ship down. We want to understand how to properly maximize the industry and maybe even grow it. But there are some fundamental things we have to recognize before that can happen. We need to understand that maybe we have a problem with myopia in the industry, and also understanding that the major trade organizations that are in this, while they do amazing work, the priorities are not in radio. And the priorities for growth are, as we've all seen, are in cellular. The priorities of growth are in anything that gets somebody better, bigger, and faster data. So I think it's important for the industry to understand. So how do we join with that? How do we invest big data companies in broadcasting? That would end up being a boon for us. And hopefully it can happen. I mean, hopefully somebody will see some value in spectrum other than selling it off to a mobile phone company, and really think about, hey, here is a valuable resource that has serious potential and is still making double-digit growth. And here's the way it can be built on. Here's how we can message this. And I think that's the optimistic point of view, I think that's a realistic point of view, but it will require partnerships we've never made before. And I think that's where we need to be looking for the future, in general.
Well, any last final words before I?
But one of the questions you would ask was best advice.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so I have a few of these over the years. So when I first became a broker, I asked a bunch of my broker friends to give me advice about how to deal with owners and GMs, et cetera. And so here's some of my quotes that I've gotten from different people. I won't mention names, I won't credit anybody, but the people who gave me this information will know who they are. That's one. This is one that's not particularly pure. This isn't just an inbred industry, it's an incestuous industry. That was one that I got from a friend of mine. Sometimes the best deal you do is the deal you don't do. And that goes for engineers as well. You think you're going to work for somebody, think you're going to make a bunch of money, pay attention to who you're joining with. Don't get too hungry just to have a job. Pay attention to the character of the organization before you walk in. Sometimes the deal or the job, the best job you take is the job you don't take. I think that's important. Over the years, there's been a lot of abuse in the broadcast engineers in the broadcast engineering industry, and certainly not a proper appreciation for the critical role that's played until the person leaves, and then suddenly it's a panic and the checkbook opens. I think it's important to understand that and who you work for. And the last one, back in the 1990s, a friend of mine said, I was charging fairly low rates I was green and wanting to get in, so I charged fairly low rates. And another broadcast engineer came up to me and says, a copy repair guy makes $120 an hour. Why are you charging $35 per hour? How much more than a copy repair guy do you need to know to do your job? And that's very true of broadcast engineers. You have to have way more knowledge and very well-rounded knowledge to do this job. And you're worth it.
Well, Rob, thank you so much for sitting down with me for however long it's been.
Certainly.
And talking about your career and how you would feel new people coming in, giving them some advice, and just kind of giving a view of someone who I respect in the industry. You've made quite a splash in the industry, if you will. And I mean, come on, you really have, and I appreciate it. And I know it's hard for us to talk about ourselves.
I'll bet at least maybe half to a quarter of the people that are on your program don't or that watch your program don't know. But it's okay.
That's okay.
It doesn't matter. What matters is you're doing what you want to do, and you love it, and it's never not going to be in your blood.
And the whole point of these videos is to highlight people who are the behind the scenes people. So.
Certainly appreciate your contribution as well, and the contribution you're going to make in this industry. No question.
We'll see.
It'll happen.
Well, thank you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being a part of this channel. There will be more videos like this, so stay tuned.